Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's live reading. My name is Katherine D. Graham, and I'm going to be reading the first chapter of Splitting Dawn today, which is a book that is not available yet. It is coming out exclusively in the Realm of Darkness box set in October. I'm super excited because that's just a couple months away at this point, like 3 months, I think. So you guys will get to see this before anybody else. Hey, good to see you. So I'm streaming this live. That way you can share your thoughts, comments, guesses as far as how the story is going to go live in the chat. If you're watching the replay, feel free to drop your thoughts in the comments. We're going to read the opening, which is just a couple page opening, and then the first chapter. Now, if you would like to actually keep this opening and first chapter for yourself, you can email me a screenshot of your pre-order receipt and I will send it to you so that you have it today. And that email is contact@katherinedgraham.com. I'll drop that in the chat here. It is available on Amazon, on Facebook, on Facebook. Wow, sorry, I got distracted seeing comments. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, a whole bunch of other places as part of the Realm of Darkness set that comes out in October. But I'm giving away the opening so that you can keep it and reread it. I'm also looking for Street Team and Advanced Reader Copy readers. I will be posting about that this week. To join the Advanced Reader Copy readers and Street Team will receive a full copy of Splitting Dawn in August, 2 months before it comes out. No reviews are required or expected, although they're certainly appreciated if you're a part of that team and you would just feel like leaving one. So definitely hit me up over Messenger on either Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And that time I meant to say Facebook. Or send me an email again to that email address and I will get you on the team. Hey, Melissa! So excited for another Splitting Dawn novel. So Splitting Dawn is the very first full-length novel in the Splitting Worlds series, which right now has a couple duologies out and one that has a second part of the duology coming out in August. You've got Tengu Warrior Princess Ray's dark fantasy duology that follows a Tengu as she battles with Lucif, who's the king of the underworld, to reclaim what should be her crown as the Tengu queen. And then there's a duology about Kiara. Kiara is the main character of this story. About Kaylin and Draco and Nate, who I won't say a whole lot about here, but you can get a free copy of that book, Splitting Dusk, through signing up for my newsletter on my website today, and that's www.katherinedgraham.com. And so that's a first part of a duology, and then the last duology is a dark fantasy romance, which is what Splitting Dawn is. And it follows Demon King Draco and the Angel Princess Syracuse as she falls from the heavens to flee for basically her life and her freedom. And the first volume of that came out back in April, and the second volume is coming out in August. So those are all some very quick, like 2 hour or less reads. My husband, who hardly ever even reads fiction, read the entire Downfall of the Queen novella in one sitting, basically, and Splitting Dawn as well. So if you've read it, I'd love to hear your comments about who your favorite characters are. You can drop that in the chat. Splitting Dawn doesn't really carry any of those characters over. They are meant to be able to be read by themselves without huge spoilers, except for Demon King Draco, who does have a pretty heavy role in this book, and a cameo by one other character that I'm not going to say for the sake of spoilers. So Splitting Dawn is a dark fantasy romance. There are 4 potential love interests in this book. There's a lot of different tropes. Friends to lovers, enemies to lovers, forbidden love. It all comes together in here. So for those of you who read my books and know that normally romance is like one of my side plots, it's going to be a much bigger focus in this book. And it will be a third person point of view as opposed to first person POV like The Vow That Twisted Fate. So I'm just excited to dive in and show it off. With that, let me get to the reading. Great War 324, Sixth Moon, Unallied Lands. Lunev rode through a darkness so thick that even his vampire eyes couldn't make out the fanged shadows on his heels. He knew there was no escape from the hellhounds, not with sleep raining down on them and gusts of icy wind buffeting them. If the hounds don't take her, the cold will. He clutched his princess's frigid, limp body closer to his own. Hot puffs of air scorched him like flames where the hellhounds snipped against his ankles, occasionally grazing his skin with their fangs. How his horse remained unharmed was a mystery to him. Coarse fur rubbed against his bare arm as one of the accursed creatures leapt for his princess. Letting the reins fall, his sword, long abandoned at a battlefield miles behind them, he punched blindly at the creature. His knuckles cracked when they connected with the hound's side. Stunned, the creature toppled to the ground. The horse pulled ahead again. Somewhere in the darkness ahead of them, the gates and the drawbridge to his kingdom waited on guard for his return. But he only had faith, as thin as a fine silken thread, that they would make it that far. Despite the odds, he pressed on, pushing his horse harder and harder. His eyes burned, poison oozing from fresh wounds down his face. On the battlefield, before he left with his princess, a hound's last act was striking him with its venom-covered claws, thick and bubbling with poison that withstood even the rain. Clenching the princess closer to him, he forced himself on against the inevitable. For Kiera, all sacrifices were worth making. The magic on the castle gates will save her, he reminded himself, even if I should fall. Buckling, his horse cried out and hobbled slightly before picking up the pace again. The acidic burn of new wounds across his shoulder blades took his breath away. Dear sovereign, he begged silently, take my life, just spare hers. Horns sounded somewhere in the distance, and his heart skipped a beat. Those aren't demon horns. They're ours. His spirits fell as quickly as they lifted. The horns were far ahead. The cavalry who bore them were too far away to reach him before he was overtaken. But they can protect her, at least. A knot formed in his stomach, and his throat was thick, but a resolve fell over him. With fumbling fingers, he ran a hand over her perfect face. Her eyes were still closed. The warmth of magic spread from his fingertips into her cold skin as he muttered an incantation he'd never wanted to use again. An incantation his mother taught him years before, in case there was a night ever like this. If I can't escape with her, she doesn't need this horror to follow her through life. She can be free if she can forget. Green and red spots freckled his otherwise dark vision as poison seeped down into his eyes. Pulling a rope from the sling pack at his side, he threw it in a loop around her, and then forced his fingers to tie it securely around the saddle, praying for her safety. His shaking hands traced her face one last time. You won't remember me, his voice cracked as he pressed a kiss against her forehead, with trembling lips. But you'll be safe, I promise. Panting and nipping at his ankles again, mere inches from his right, a hellhound was surely about to pounce. He pulled his feet from the stirrups and leaned forward to pet his horse's neck. Take her home and do not fail me, old friend, he bid his mount. He didn't give himself time to think. Taking a deep breath, he jumped into the waiting clutches of his pursuers, with only his magic to fight with. It did not matter, though. Not anymore. She would be safe. So that is the opening. Anyone else having problems with their feet? Oh no, Melissa, are you able to hear me? I hope it resolved itself. I know that was a few minutes ago. Hopefully it has cleared up. The recording will go up too, so if for some reason it was internet connection, hopefully you can catch whatever cut out on the replay. Sorry about that. Alright, so we are going from the opening into chapter 1. Better now. Okay, yay. Awesome. Chapter 1. Great War 325. Fourth Moon. First Allied Land. Princess Kiara's brush froze mid-stroke as she pondered the vibrant but forbidden landscape beyond the walls of her citadel. Should I paint the impaled bodies too? Beyond her bedroom window, the luscious green plains and deceptively beautiful forest beckoned her to leave the safety of her walls, a temptation only tempered by the fact that no one who ventured beyond the walls ever returned. Not as a human, anyway. The remains of 6 deserters hung suspended just above the city gates, a warning from the Demon King and his army of ghouls. These were new kills. The crows sated their gluttony on the fresh flesh, just as plump nobles within the castle walls would feast on the crows at dinner. Just the thought of eating crow again turned Kiara's stomach. A dull ache throbbed in her head at the thought of the Demon King. Setting down her brush, she massaged her scalp and squeezed her eyes shut in vain at attempting to banish what few memories she had of her brief time outside the walls. It had been the dead of night, sleet mixed with rain, an odd combination for midsummer, stung her face. Pain, horrific, unceasing, head-splitting pain drowned out all sound, all thoughts. Slobbering, cannot speak this word. Slobbering, savage hellhounds had strained against their leashes, occasionally gaining an inch or two's lead from their monstrous demon handlers. A single figure, a faceless shadow of swirling black smoke in the shape of a human, knelt beside her. He whispered something. She felt his warm breath against her ear, and then an incessant pounding on her door jerked her out of her fragmented memory and back into the present. After smoothing back her hair, she gasped at the sight of grass-green paint smeared across her hands. My hair! There was no time to do anything about it, though. Without waiting for her response, the door flung open, and one of the court's many heralds entered the room uninvited. A throng of soldiers in full dress uniform stood at attention in the hall, pressing their bodies close to the open door. Her Majesty Queen Lubia of the Ruby Throne, the herald announced. Stepping aside, the herald bowed low to make way for the widowed queen. Standing, her face on fire at the paint-stained frock and green-smeared hair in which she would meet her impossible-to-please mother, Kiara slipped into her routinely practiced facade of an otherwise perfect princess. She hung her head, balling her right hand into a fist which she pressed over her heart in submission. Queen Luvia's lavender vanilla perfume preceded her into the room, followed by a swishing waterfall of elegant skirts so wide they barely made it through the narrow door. The queen's scarlet-red stained lips pursed into a thin line. Her bright blue eyes, heavily adorned with deep blue eyeshadow and the minuscule diamonds dusted upon her lashes, narrowed as they flickered from her disheveled daughter to the artwork in progress on the easel. Crossing her arms, the queen said nothing for a moment, the rapid tapping of a single shoe the only sound in the dense silence. Kiara tried not to think of soldiers and herald in front of her, thought of their only princess, the heir to the throne, dressed thusly on a feast day in the presence of the Queen Mother. Leave us, Queen Lubia snapped. The door closed immediately. Without thinking, Kiara almost broke out of her bow without permission. Her heart pounded more at the thought of facing her mother alone than going back to the heartless hellhounds in her memories. She tried to swallow, but found that her throat was suddenly parched. At ease, Kiara, Luvia said at last, her words followed by an exasperated sigh. Kiara raised her head, forcing herself to meet her mother's gaze. Queen Luvia of the allied human lands stood a head taller than her daughter, and was a woman of incomparably dazzling beauty. Perfect makeup smoothed her round face. The ceremonial crown of gold inset with rubies and with white fur trim sat precariously atop heaped coils of braided curly black hair. Returning her attention to the painting, the queen's fingers entwined in an almost prayerful fist below her chin. Kiara's heart skipped a beat. Does she not like the painting? It wouldn't surprise the princess. Her mother seldom approved of any of her actions these days. Not since the king died 3 years ago. When the weight of the silence of the room could no longer be any heavier, a deep sigh escaped the queen's lips. Her eyes fell closed and her shoulders sagged. Kira has overheard servants say her mother still looked like a woman in her 30s, but wrinkles and lines more common to those closer to 50 peeked through her makeup when she showed this level of exhaustion. A worm of guilt burrowed through Kira's stomach. At 20 years old, she should have wed 2 years ago, when she first became eligible for marriage. Her marriage would have allowed her to relieve her mother of the burden that she was ill-equipped to bear in her grief. Luvia and the king had been inseparable. Perhaps his passing alone was more than the queen should have been expected to bear. "Find something to say. Anything," Kira urged herself. Despite her empathy toward her mother's loss, the ever-widening rift between mother and daughter was not one easily bridged. The impatient shuffling of boots just outside the closed door drew Kira's thoughts to the insane number of soldiers packed in the hallway. There were far too many to tote around in the safety of their own walls. Bitterness welled within her heart. "You need the whole army just to come to my room, Mother?" The sarcasm in her words left a stone of regret in the pit of her stomach. "I get enough disrespect from the elite, Kiera," Luvia warned, a glacial glare cutting the princess to her core. "I will not tolerate it from you, especially not on a feast day, and one that falls on a day of court, no less." Kiera's frown deepened, but she bit her lip. A day of court explained the overly formal attire, but why had Kiera not been told of the day of court? The princess attended all courts in recent months, preparing for the day of her marriage, where she would also be crowned queen of the 14 human allied lands. "My apologies. Based on the jewels and the gown you've chosen, I'm assuming the entire allied elite must be in attendance today." "I do not owe you an explanation of my security choices," the queen said, ignoring the iciness in her daughter's comment. "Of course not," Kira mumbled. All signs of fatigue in the queen vanished. Standing tall once more, the queen adopted the air she maintained whenever diplomacy was involved, a warning that the time for any personal conversation between them had come and passed. "You'll be happy to hear that this is not a courtesy visit." "What can I do for you?" Kira asked, forcing herself to bite back further sarcasm. "I'm sure you're familiar with the Fourth Land's elite, Padronis?" Flashbacks to Kira's childhood, a happier time when her mother loved and doted on her, and her father would move land and sky for her, came flooding back at the mention of the Fourth Land. The fishing lands? Trips to the ocean in that province had been the highlights of Kira's summers. Even though she never played with other children unattended, she enjoyed the freedom of the ocean. It was the only place in her closed-in world where there were no walls. It was the only place bloodthirsty demons and vampires couldn't reach their human enemies. Elite Padronis' navy was robust and widespread, keeping enemy ships at bay. "Yes, at least you remember something about the country you will soon rule," the queen quipped. Kira opened her mouth to protest, but a raised hand from the queen cut her off. "It doesn't matter. You soon will meet Lord Padronis again. He has requested a marriage interview for the hand of his firstborn son, Caesar." Kira's mouth went as dry as her throat. Her palms were clammy, and she forced them into fists to keep them from shaking. A brief memory from their last trip to the Fourth Land came rushing back to her. A boy in noble robes with wild green eyes had whirled on her with a bloody knife in hand. A poor dead animal lay not far off, and an injured maid cowered before the teenage noble. "Hey, Caitlin, good to see you. Thank you, Melissa." "Not him. Caesar?" Kira's words were barely a whisper. The normally confident princess was scarcely able to utter his name. If the queen noticed her daughter's unease, she didn't let on. Instead, she motioned up and down to her daughter's bedraggled form. "I had hoped you'd be clothed appropriately for once, that I could take you down now. Caesar accompanied his father to court today." Kira struggled to hide the relief overflowing within her, but a sigh of relief still escaped. The queen's eyes narrowed anew, and a brief tinge of red flared across her cheeks. "Don't let it get to your head. The interview is only a formality. Dinner is in 2 hours, Kira, and your engagement will be announced then." The room warped around Kira, and her face went cold. Those hauntingly wild green eyes came back to her mind once more. "Mother, they say—" Enough! I know what the servants say, and it is merely idle gossip. I will not hear a word of it. They say his father beat his mother to death, Kira wanted to shout. Instead, her hands flew to her face to cover her tears and gaping mouth from her unimpressed mother. Doesn't she know? Doesn't she care? If the topic at hand had been about anything else, anyone else, she would have had no trouble telling her mother exactly how she felt. After all, she was not known for mincing her words despite being a princess. But something about her mother's tone, and the very choice of Caesar as her betrothed, shattered the hope of any remaining relationship she once had with the queen. Swishing of skirts and the opening of an unoiled, squeaky hinged door announced the queen's departure. She could not spare a moment, not even to comfort her daughter, whose hopes and dreams she had just dashed. The queen's steps paused just before reaching the door. Your childhood days are over now, Kiera. For once, there was the slightest hint of regret in her mother's soft whisper. Forcing herself to look up, Kira found herself staring into the sad eyes of a mother who once loved her. Or at least, Kira once thought her mother loved her. The queen's eyes glistened, but no tears escaped. Those days died with your father, she said. I am no longer able to be the doting mother I was when you were young. I must be your monarch instead, at least until you take the throne this autumn. It's the only way our family can stay in power. I wish you would understand that. Silence smothered Kiera when the door closed, leaving her alone with her fate. Thin trails of tears grew cold as she sat, listening for the thundering bootsteps to cease. A glance out the window at the sky showed the evening to be approaching far faster than Kiera wanted to admit. She'd washed out her hair and changed into a clean, simple day gown made of tan cotton like the servants wore, but with white silken bodice embroidered with red and green posies around the sleeves and hem. A luxurious golden gown with green accents hung just inside her door for later in the evening. Obviously, a pick from her mother, the gown was at the height of fashion, with hooped skirts she couldn't be expected to sit down in, and a cinched corset that she could forget eating in. She would steal even the joy of eating from me. Stones scattered against the window pane. Running to look around, a smile replaced her frown in an instant. Tension slid from her shoulders as she waved, fumbling with the lock on the window so that she could throw it open and lean out. One story down, on the cobblestones in the courtyard, her lifelong friend Toma waved back at her. Someone must be covering the smelter for him today. Toma's white shirt and black leather pants were clean of the dirt and grease they would have after working hours with his father, the blacksmith, by this late in the day. His short black hair even looked freshly washed and styled. You have a minute? Kira whispered down to him, hoping he could hear her over the typical noise of the city. He grinned bashfully, motioning for her to climb down the trellis beside the window like she used to when they were children. Her heart pounded in her chest as she noticed his blush. His narrow eyes smiled back at her, though, along with his dazzling white teeth, far whiter than her own. I can't go out like this. A quick look at her dress left her frazzled. But you may not have much time. Be right down, she called as softly as she could. Toma flopped himself against the tree by her window as she scrambled to change clothes. Pulling on a baggy white blouse and tan breeches Toma himself had given her at the last sword training rendezvous, she was ready to escape the castle, if even for a moment. She shoved one foot into a boot, then the other. A strip of leather from the art table served to tie back her thick, still wet hair. The rough wooden trellis mounted to the wall outside her window wobbled, creaking in her grasp. While she used to sneak down the trellis in her youth, Toma's acceptance into the courier network, as well as his apprenticeship with the castle blacksmith, his father, let him come and go on the castle grounds as he pleased. If it hadn't been for a need to sneak out, unbeknown to her mother, Kira would have just walked out the front gate like always. There's no way this is going to hold me, and I don't think I can sneak out through the kitchen. Dinner's just a couple hours away. Standing, Toma motioned for her to climb down. His smile was encouraging, and he even positioned himself near the bottom of the trellis to add support. Kira gulped down the lump in her throat. Despite being only 2 stories off the ground, the land swam like an ocean beneath her. Her chest tightened as the world spun for a moment, and she closed her eyes in an attempt to ground herself. It's not that high up, she tried to reason with herself. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill. Sitting on the windowsill, she forced one foot out and onto the trellis. Splinters of wood sprinkled down on Toma, who ducked his head. I don't know, Toma. She willed her trembling hands to be steady, for her heart to stay in her chest instead of escaping. Holding up a finger, she went back inside and closed the window. She debated her options for a moment, weighing disappointment from her mother by running away before the feast with her no need to meet Toma. To spend a moment in his arms, and another smashing something with a training blade. If she's marrying me off tonight, I'll be darned about sneaking out for a few hours. Her mind made up, she rushed down the halls, then the stairs, and then out the kitchen entrance, ignoring the servants' questioning glances all the while. Seeing Toma was the only thing she cared about. She was almost clear of the castle when she bowled over a slender servant woman with long silver hair and matching silver eyes. Silver eyes? Something about that unusual color tugged at her, but she brushed the thought aside. I'm so worried about that, Kira muttered, quickly kneeling over to help the student retrieve the scattered lemons that tumbled from her basket during her fall. Please, Highness, I can manage. Forgive me for not watching for you, the servant pleaded, bowing again and again. Her accent. I haven't heard that accent before. The servant's silver eyes pleaded with Kira's to leave her be, but there were no tears or shame in them. The servant practically exuded confidence. She couldn't remember hiring a silver-eyed servant, especially not for the kitchen, which was under her management in her mother's stead. I'm sorry again, Kira said before rushing off to find Toma. She could look into the silver-haired woman later, but her time with Toma was ticking. What if he gave up and left? Running to the tree for fear of having missed her opportunity with him, Kira was breathless by the time she arrived. Slow down a bit, love, Toma chided, grabbing her around the waist from behind and scooping her into a hug. Wood smoke and the scent of metal clung to his shirt, and even in his freshly washed hair. His 5 o'clock shadow tickled her neck when he kissed it. Toma! Kira gasped, pulling away slightly. The joy dancing in his eyes brought a giggle from her lungs, despite the awkwardness of his embrace. The admiration she garnered from her oldest friend was not lost on her. Toma was in every way a man she would be proud to marry, if only marrying a commoner was permitted. Toma snatched up her hand without a word, tugging her alongside him through the castle grounds. As always, he asked for no explanation about her pulling away from him, and he respected the distance she put between them without complaint. His smile never faded, and his hand was warm in hers. What's wrong, Kay? He finally asked, not about them, but about the weight visibly pulling her down. The thought of crushing his heart with the news of a betrothal was an added layer of sadness Kira couldn't bear. I can always tell him later, she told herself. Let's just have one last moment of happiness before I crush his soul. I don't want to talk about it, she said aloud, shuffling her boots in the dirt. After studying her in silence for a few moments, he shrugged. While his non-pushy nature was always an appreciated aspect of their friendship, an ache spread through Kira's heart at the lack of pressure this time. She battled herself in silence, her desires and her realities clashing within her like the demon and vampire armies outside their walls. I'm the queen-to-be, she reminded herself at last, and he knows I won't tell him anything about politics. I can't blame him for not asking me, so why do I care now? Well then, he said, oblivious to her disease. He pulled out 2 wooden practice swords and handed one to her. I've made these new daggers for you, he teased, which you can have, if you can beat me. That sounds more like it, she said. Mischief danced in her eyes. And that is the opening to Splitting Dawn. chapter 1 and the opening. Caitlin asked, is this set before or after Angel's Abdication books? So Angel's Abdication technically takes place a couple hundred years before Splitting Dawn. Draco is in both books, but Angel's Ascension, or Ascendance, the second book in that duology, will be out in August, and Splitting Dawn will come out in October. So if you're worried about spoilers, you won't get any spoilers in the first few chapters of Splitting Dawn, and you can definitely catch up with Angel's Abdication and then Angel's Ascendance before the Realm of Darkness set comes out October 4th. I need to know more about these characters. These characters have my heart. Of course, I've been sort of living with them in my head for the last several years. Melissa Wise, love the opening. I like how you always start with characters. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like a lot of my stories follow the characters because the plot is interesting to me, but really the growth in a character is what makes a book special. And of course, in an epic fantasy, you can get dragged down into the weeds if you let it, and then you have to go back and cut all those darlings out later. There's still some editing tweaks that need to be done, so the version that you're hearing today is the advanced reader version, and there might be some minor adjustments to verbiage and all of that before the book comes out. Caitlin, I have a soft spot for Draco. I think you probably know why. Yeah, so one of the perks, if you're watching, one of the perks that my email list subscribers get is the opportunity to put their name in the hat for, like, naming other characters or choosing candle scents or choosing titles of books. Like Starfire Express was a title chosen by my newsletter list subscribers, and Caitlin's name was drawn as a character for Demon King Draco's first love in Angel's Abdication, which is already out and is sort of that shorter read. Draco is actually the villain in Splitting Dawn, and he's very near and dear to my heart, so it made it a very, very fun book to write because I just love his character overall. He's never takes himself too seriously, but he's also very chivalrous. The other guy characters, we met Toma in the opening, and you saw a hint of Lunev, who is the vampire elf prince. He's the one riding the horse in the opening, which you find out in chapter 2 of the book. You've got Lunev, you've got Toma, you've got Caesar, who's the bad guy, the prince she's betrothed to. So there's just 4 different romantic interest options in this book, and I'm excited to see what everybody thinks of it. So yeah, I will send you guys a copy of the version of Splitting Dawn that I read today, the opening and chapter 1. If you've pre-ordered the Realm of Darkness set, again, just email that to me. And if you'd like to be in on the sneak peeks before the book comes out, including an email telling you that my ARC team and Street team has reopened invitations, you'll need to sign up for my newsletter to do that. And that's at www.catherinedgraham.com. Who's your favorite villain you've written? Mine is Maedra. This is hard. I think when I look at villains, I look at which one is more fun to write. Not necessarily fun to write, but more intriguing to write. Because I end up sort of feeling like they're my prodigal children that I want to see redeemed at the end. And sometimes my villains get redemption, and sometimes my villains, they don't. So if you're reading Down Falls the Queen, Down Falls the King, you know what happens with Lucifer. I wouldn't necessarily say he's a character that gets redeemed as much as he sticks to his evil ways. Draco is one of those borderline characters. I think Maedra was one of my most fun characters to write because I see so much good in such an evil character. She's so much more than just a bad, evil sorceress. And in many ways, I feel like she could almost be an anti-hero of her own book. And so my sister and I have been working on a Vow That Twisted Fate prequel. and it stars Maedra as the main character, and just seeing how she got to where she was in the Violet Twisted Fate, and it's made me love her even more. But Draco would be a really close second. Um, so yeah, but that is what we've got going on. I will be releasing additional sneak peeks, and I will be doing some newsletter subscriber only lives reading chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5 of Splitting Dawn over the next few weeks, for, again, exclusively email list subscribers in a private chat room where you can actually talk, like Zoom. So if you want in on those, definitely subscribe to my emails. I will not be putting those up on YouTube. And I appreciate you being here. Yeah, more Val. So many things in the writing process. I have big news coming. I really appreciate you being part of my writer community. I can't wait to spill the beans. So you'll just have to hang with me. Let's get through the Godmother coming out at the end of next month. Take care, everybody. Bye.